Okay, John?
Okay, good morning. Welcome to the world of Mark Catesby. Catesby was an Englishman, a naturalist, an artist, and explorer. He came to the South Carolina colony in 1722, nearly 300 years ago. His illustrations and descriptive text would later comprise his publication, The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, one of the most important books of natural science in that century and the most expensive book of that century. Could we move on to the slides? Yes, there we are. Good. All right. Next slide, please. Catesby, as a youth, showed interest in the world of nature, and he made frequent visits to the home of his grandfather at the village at Castle Headingham in Essex. And it was his grandfather, Nicholas Jekyll, who had a botanical garden of some note, and probably his grandfather introduced Mark to John Ray, a founder of modern biology nomenclature, and to Samuel Dale, another prominent natural scientist and neighbors of his grandfather. In his 30s, Catesby accompanied his sister Elizabeth to colonial Williamsburg in 1712, and there he was able to collect and send specimens and seeds, that is, specimens of animals and seeds of plants, to Samuel Dale back in England, to his grandfather, and to Thomas Fairchild, another natural scientist. Okay, next slide, please. When Catesby returned to England 7 years later in 1719, he was somewhat of a celebrity because some of his specimens were unknown until then by Europe. Because of his success in Virginia, he was nominated to be a naturalist explorer for the Carolina colony by a number of scientists, William Sherrod and Hans Sloane. These nominations were made to the Royal Society, that is the Royal Society of London for Natural Knowledge, and it was presided over by Sir Isaac Newton. So that's our South Carolina's connection to Sir Isaac Newton. And so Catesby was chosen to travel to Carolina to collect specimens, take notes, and to make drawings of Carolina flora and fauna. Next slide. Okay, you can imagine the cultural shock and climate shock that Catesby faced when he arrived in May of 1722. The hot, humid weather and the colonial culture with its large labor force of enslaved persons and its newly but sparsely populated backcountry settled by Germans, Swiss, French Huguenots, English, and Scots. Okay, also, it was a period of danger, but as James Stewart and the Powder Magazine mentioned earlier, because of the Yamasee War was in 1715, 1716, so it would have only been a decade before. And also because of the death of John Lawson a decade earlier, another naturalist killed by the Tuscarora in the North Carolina colony. Okay, next slide, please. All right. This is another map of colonial South Carolina. The light blue dash path would have most probably been the path that Mark Catesby took from Charleston to Fort Moore. He, again, as I said earlier, he arrived in May and he was ready to begin his work with the backing of the Royal Society. He wanted to begin. He met in the Charleston area many of the prominent plantation families, the Warings, the Skeens, and the Moores. James Moore Jr., who lived in the Goose Creek area, probably was instrumental in helping Catesby uh, put together a group of militia to escort him to Fort Moore. They traveled on pack horses and horses without packs, of course, along that 140 mile trek. Okay, Fort Moore, as most of you know, is in the Silver Bluff area of Aiken County on the South Carolina side across from Augusta. And there is the Silver Bluff Nature Preserve there in the Silver Bluff area. Catesby wanted to see all parts of the Carolina colony, and he did not want to be on the same spot in the same month 2 years in a row. So, for example, if he was in Charleston in the spring, then he would not want, in the next year, he would not want to be in Charleston in the spring again. He was the first to name the geographical areas of South Carolina that weren't used to any great use until the 20th century, but he named the Midlands the Pine Belt, the Sand Hills area, and he also used the term the Piedmont for the upper backcountry, the upcountry. All right, next slide. John? John Jameson. Next slide, please, sir. Can you hear me? John is my projectionist today. John, can you hear me?
Yeah, and I'm trying to get it to go.
Okay. Well, although I can continue to speak, although there is no text as proof that he went to Fort Congaree or to Camden, we do suspect that he did visit there because he was interested in seeing the Sandhills as well as the upper Midlands. There we go. Can you move forward to the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Catesby was a keen observer of birds, and he makes a point in his text that he drew birds from life rather than birds that were killed, unlike John James Audubon. He makes a point that he tried to, at most times, draw birds from life. These are bobolinks or rice birds. But in the interest of time, I don't have a whole lot of his artwork, but you can see those in various websites. Um, he was very interested in observing the movements of the rice birds that were in Charleston and at the rice plantations in May, and then they moved away. Can we move on to the next slide? These are three areas in which he was a forerunner of modern day or scientific thought. He was a forerunner of thought about bird migration. In the late 1700s, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, birds were thought to hibernate rather than migrate. It was thought that birds hibernated like bats. And he, through observation, reported that birds, in fact, do migrate. And in part, it was his observations of the rice birds and their movement to follow the rice season from the Charleston area to the Bahamas that led him to make this conclusion. All right, next slide. All right, also he wrote about the effects of man and weather. He also concluded that the further north to colder climates, the smaller the same species was in his findings. All right, next slide. All right, also, he discusses the limits of natural resources. He tells the story of traveling with a group of men up the Savannah River, and in fishing, a number of his fellow travelers overfish and leave lots of fish behind. And he remembers the incident 10 years later and includes it in his book. And so he was sensitive to the limits of natural resources and the potential waste of natural resources, even in America. Okay, next slide. This is the Carolina parakeet. Again, just a part of the drawing. He eliminated or tried to eliminate perspective and shading. That's why his birds seem so flat and primitive to us. But he believed in order to encourage scientific understanding, he limited shadowing and limited use of depth or perspective, so his fellow scientists could view the birds more basically. And again, as I mentioned earlier, his natural history book was considered the book of the year, the book of the century, I should say, with 220 plates, that is 220 illustrations, 109 birds, but it also included reptiles, amphibians, fish, insects, and other mammals, and of course, plants. All right, next slide. All right, so we're less than 2 years away from 2022, in which South Carolina will be celebrating the tricentennial of his visit to South Carolina. And we are already in the planning stages of a number of events. Our kickoff event will be Earth Day weekend, which is April the 23rd and 24th. We will have an event at the Congaree National Park that weekend. It will include bird walks led by members of the Audubon Society and several presentations on birding, history, and Native American bird lore. And there will be a set of resource tables manned by conservation groups and the Audubon Society. So it promises to be a very exciting event, and there will be other events throughout the year 2022 in the Low Country and in the Midlands. So please join us for 2022. Any questions?
Any questions from anyone? What?
Yeah, I'm going to just talk while it goes, if that's okay.
Okay, that's right.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. So we're talking about the period, the prehistoric period. We're talking about the Congaree, who lived at the junction of the Congaree Creek and the Congaree River. People could follow the rivers to the coast or back again up to the fall line. Once you got to the fall line, if you had goods or whatever, you would have to unload them and put them on pack horse trains, or even human burdeners would have to carry like materials into the backcountry. And so this area here became very important even during ancient times because the fall line was here. And the fall line allowed people to cross the river from east to west fairly. It provided a way to do that with like rocks and things in the river. So we know that there were two ancient trading paths. One of the paths was the Occaneechi path that came out of Virginia that ended in Augusta, Georgia. It was the what came to be known as the Catawba path, and the other one was the Cherokee path. And the Cherokee path developed after the Amnesty War. So there was this path would converge, and the Catawba would both converge at the area near Casey, where you will see the development of Congaree Fort 1, Congaree Fort 2. You'll see the development of Saxagotha, Granby, and all the rest of that. So you had lots of Indian diplomats as well as traders moving up and down the path. And like was talked about earlier, this was one of those trading factories or trading posts when they built Congaree Fort 1 in 1718. And it became a destination for people, not only coming down from Native American villages in the Piedmont and the mountains, but also coming up from Charleston and the coast. And this picture here depicts some of the diplomats that were sent to England, actually in 1730. So in that area in 1765, you've got the two Camden merchants, John Chestnut and Joseph Kershaw, who build the Casey House right on the Cherokee Path. It's overlooking the Congaree River on a rise, is what they say. These two Camden merchants, they have stores at Camden, Cheraw, and now at the Congaree. So they've got a pretty wide sway over a lot of the backcountry as far as trade. And they have connections to help them with that trade. And they have trading partners in Charleston, and these trading partners are connected to Quakers in Philadelphia, who then have access to like international markets. So there's, they're able to draw upon that, and these areas become areas of trade for not only Native Americans, but also for settlers that are coming into the area. Now, the Casey, the structure that became the trading post that would become the Casey House, we know that the family lived above the store. Below was areas where you could store materials, if you've got tobacco, you could store it there. If you've got indigo, you could store it there. Later, with the coming of cotton, you could store it also there. And people could also carry out trade. There was credit that a lot of the settlers used. And of course, you could acquire all of those English goods, all of those things of the Atlantic world, whether it's tools or whether it's rum, tea, or coffee. All of these things are going to be coming into this area. There's By 1765, there is the old Cherokee Path has been expanded into what's going to become the Old State Road, and products are going to travel from the Low Country, from Charleston into this area. It said it took, I think, a wagon or a person on horseback did 20 miles a day or so. So 3 or 4 days for people to reach from Charleston to get here. But you could also put products on boats, and they could go down the Congaree to the Santee to Wateree and to the Atlantic Ocean. So this was a pretty important place. It sat near a ferry. And so when the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, and then of course the British come south in 1779, the British want to control the backcountry, and they want places like this store. And so it's near a ferry, it's on a major road. So what are they going to do? They're going to occupy, they're going to occupy this store, and they're going to build a palisade around it. They're going to put a powder magazine. They're going to pull in a couple of 12-pounders, and they're going to eventually call this Fort Granby. And so there's 2 battles at Fort Granby. There's actually 4, but we'll start with the first 2. General Thomas Sumter in February 1781, he attacks the fort, and he is being very successful in taking the fort. He's kind of sieging it, but unfortunately from Camden comes Lord Rawdon, and Lord Rawdon brings a larger British force. So all Sumter can do is blow up the powder magazine and destroy the provisions at the fort. And so he has to, of course, they can't destroy it in that attempt. But the Americans come back, and in May 1781, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, who's the father of Robert E. Lee, serving in South Carolina with the American Legion from Virginia, he is assigned to take the fort. Now, why do they want it? They want it because it's storing provisions for the British, and those provisions can be distributed to the backcountry. So Lighthorse Harry Lee, he is able to roll a cannon up to the Congaree River on a very foggy morning, and once he gets it up to the edge of the river, when the fog lifts, they begin a bombardment of the structure. And then, of course, he also begins to take the grounds around the fort. And after several hours of this, the British commander, who's Andrew Maxwell, who's with the Prince of Wales Regiment, will surrender the fort. And one of the things that takes place with this is that he offers very good terms to Major Maxwell when he surrenders the fort. That makes Sumter kind of mad and the men. So Lighthorse Harry Lee has to skedaddle. By the way, we have a cannon. We have several cannonballs from this battle at the KC Museum. So this is just one example. If you haven't been, you can come by and see a couple of the examples from the battle that took place there. There are 2 other stories that go along with the Casey House. One is the story of Emily Giger. Emily is supposedly an 18-year-old young woman, and she volunteers to take a message from Nathaniel Greene to General Sumter. She has to ride through the British lines. So she sets out with this message, this piece of paper that has a message from one general to another, and she is unfortunately captured by the British. And she is taken to the upstairs of the structure, and Lord Rawdon is commanding it at the time, and Lord Rawdon says, well, young lady, I'm too much of a British gentleman to search you, but I'm going to send for another lady to come in and search you. So supposedly Emily is locked in the room. She takes out the message she has. She reads it, memorizes it. She tears the message up, and Emily eats the message. And therefore, she becomes a true heroine of the American Revolution in doing so. We also have our setup, our Emily Giger room. The other story goes along with General Lord Charles Cornwallis. He's overall commander of the British troops in the South. And he was one day playing on his elegant tea table out in the field, playing cards, supposedly, and he didn't realize the Americans were sneaking up with him. When he did, he dropped his cards and left his table. Well, Colonel Troutman supposedly took the table and through marriage, this table has passed along to the Casey family. And so this is a story that we have, and we have the table that the Casey family said is General Lord Cornwallis's table at our museum. Come by and see that also. Let's see. After the revolution, Colonel Troutman, he actually acquired the trading post, and he ran it for a while as a trading post again. But then by 1817, you have James Casey purchasing the property, and James Casey, his members of his family are prominent there. They open the doors to people traveling through the area. Caroline Casey is one of the ones that is there. She marries a Casey in 1863 during the Civil War. So they service soldiers, they service people, you know, also all the way through the 20th century, they service people as they come in and out of the Casey area, and it becomes a landmark because it's on that old state road here in Casey. So the family will actually live in the structure of the 1921. Caroline Casey, one of her children is going to be a guy named William Casey. William Casey is going to become affectionately known as Uncle Billy Casey. This is a picture of Uncle, well, you saw the baby, that was him. And then this is a picture of him as an older man. And so he builds a railroad spur. He has a business. This business still stands. The building still stands in Casey by the railroad tracks. He builds a spur to meet up with the main railroad. And he's able to move goods back and forth. And people begin to put businesses in this area. And this becomes known as Casey Crossing. There's a quarry here that supports that. There's several other, the railroad builds a construction yard there, or a repair yard. So there's several different businesses that support this. And when the people get ready to name this town, they name it supposedly after Casey, because he was able to do and bring those things to the area. The last person living in the house is Caroline Casey. She will pass away in 1921. There is people that inhabited the house. I'm sorry. The Caseys moved away from the house. A lot of the family moved into town, and there's a second Casey house in town that has started. But the house is abandoned in 1921 with the death of Caroline Casey. And so the house is really going to sit abandoned there for a while. We have pictures from the 40s that show the house. Sure. There was a couple more slides there, John. I'm not sure if you can make it go forward or not. But so the house was abandoned, and what happened was supposedly, you know, it sat near the quarry. People began to take materials off the house. They began to remove items from the house like bricks and wood to build into their own houses during this period. It wasn't really protected. There was a storm that kind of damaged parts of it. And so this was in 1948. So by 1952, the Casey house had effectively been dismantled. Whatever was left there was gone. And the quarry had quarried that site. So the site where the house sat is no longer there. Now, if you come to the Casey Museum, we do have some objects from the Casey family that we can show you. And obviously the objects, you know, that we found around the trading store, around the fort, these were all found prior to the quarry digging this area up. If you're on the Riverwalk down there at Casey today, You're going to see you'll see the river on one side, and the other side you're going to see this high mound of dirt. That's the quarry where they like dump dirt from digging and whatnot. So the Casey House, unfortunately, is lost to us, but we continue to tell that story here at the Casey Museum.
Okay, Andy, thanks for much. I'm sorry about those technical glitches. We had a few this time. We're going to work. We actually, believe it or not, rehearsed this, but I'm going to share the screen here, and we can close out. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to thank everyone for attending this program, and I urge you, we're going to have another Zoom session on next Thursday, the 12th, or this Thursday, the 12th, on trees and forests in the 12,000 Year Park and the Congaree Basin. And then on the 19th, on a week from Thursday, we're going to have a program which is a virtual version of our Battle of Congaree Creek presentation that we have in the park. I want to thank everybody for attending. Please check our schedule on our website and Facebook, and we'll be sending out the invitations for these other programs. And thanks again, all the speakers. We had some technical glitches, but I think we got through it, and there was a lot learned today, and it was very, very good context for the 18th century. So thanks everyone for attending. Is there any questions that anybody has for any of the speakers today?
I just wanted to say two things. At the State House, there's also a memorial to Emily Geiger in the lobby that you can see. And if you go to Revolutionary War Field Day in Camden, on the British side, there is a table set up with the card game oftentimes, which is really cool too. It was nice to hear about it.
Okay. Anyone else?
John, this is Nelson McLeod. I'll say a couple things. I've heard Giger and Geiger today. The people I know who use that name say in South Carolina say Giger, whereas I think the rest of the world says Geiger probably. And another thing is, why do we always refer to the township plan as a scheme versus a plan or something along those lines? Is there some reasoning to that?
Sue may be able to answer that better. My understanding is that's the way it's referred to in the literature and how it was defined formally. And today's meaning of scheme is more negative. I agree. And we should probably just switch to calling it a plan, but it's defined in the text as schemes that the state came up with. So that's why that term is used.
That's interesting.
But I agree. I think we should just say plan.
Thank you.
Still use scheme to kind of address similar things, projects, strategies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting how the context of our terminology changes, and what was perfectly acceptable then and understandable is we have to take time to explain today that we're not scheming against anybody. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I thank again everybody for attending.
We have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
The person that's here with me.
Mary Louise Robinson. I'm a Camden girl, and I wanted to ask, with the French and Indian War, what were other sites over South Carolina?
There are not many.
Fort Dorchester, maybe?
What's that?
Fort Dorchester?
Fort Dorchester, Fort Congaree 2 is kind of that era. And we'll be talking about that in a future presentation. But there wasn't a lot in the Midlands that I'm aware of. Saxe-Gotha was roughly that time period, but it overlapped there a little bit. There are sites like Fort Frederica in Georgia that were part of that war that extended from the 1740s. Not a lot in the Midlands, and I'm not aware of too much in Charleston. I'm sure there were things going on, obviously.
Of course, across the mountains would have been a South Carolina fort built in Tennessee named Fort Loudon, which sat on the Little Tennessee River, and was one of those flashpoints, you know, as you're heading towards this major conflict with the French. And in fact, I think, you know, Governor Glenn tried to make the focus in that direction, you know, while Governor Dinwiddie up in Virginia was saying, hey, no, you know, it's here on the Pennsylvania frontier. So.
Yeah, and I think, Andy, depending on how you define French and Indian War at the period, Fort Prince George was contemporaneous with Fort Congaree II in the 1750s. And there was some things going on at Gowdy's Trading Post in the 1760s, part of the end of the Cherokee War in 1760. So depending on your definition, in the Midlands though, I'm not aware of very much in terms of physical sites that we can talk about.
And I'll just say one more thing. There's a story that goes along with the French and Indian War. It's connected with the Fort 2 that we're talking about. And it's the story of Peter Mercer. And Peter Mercer was a French Huguenot, and he was from Georgia, but he came and he served in South Carolina with the company that was assigned to Fort Congaree II. And Peter Mercer, in fact, all of the independent companies through South Carolina got an order in 1754 that 1/3 of their troops would be detached from each of those companies, and they were to meet in Charleston. So Peter Mercer was located at Fort Congaree II. He and 1/3 of his men marched to Charleston along with these other companies. They gathered, they got on a ship, went up to Virginia. They got off the ship. They marched into what was called the Ohio country. It was really Western Pennsylvania. And the most remarkable thing about that is they met up with a new Virginian who had just been given command, and his name was George Washington. And George Washington, of course, built Fort Necessity, and they had the first battle that touched off the French and Indian War. And not only that, Peter Mercer was killed, and George Washington gave him high praise. And not only George Washington, but also Benjamin Franklin gave Peter Mercer high praise. And that's because he continued to fight even though he was wounded. He actually received 3 wounds before he died. So that's a neat little connection from this area that ties into that French and Indian War stuff.
Okay. Also, later on our virtual programs on December 8th, we're focusing on first Fort Congaree in a detailed discussion there. We do talk a little bit about the French and Indian War period there. And then on December 15th, our program on the Congarees, we're going to have a wider scope of talking about all the activities that happened in this, what is known historically as the Congarees. So we'll be having more detail on that. Again, not a lot of physical sites, but a lot of the activities that were ongoing, during that time frame.
Hey, John, this is Nelson McLeod again.
Sure.
Ty, I believe we heard mentioned a while ago that the Casey House was originally built by Adamson as one of the partners in the mercantile business. And
Kershaw and Chestnut.
Excuse me?
Kershaw and Chestnut.
Okay, I'm sorry. Adamson was a Camden person, and Lieutenant James Adamson was one of the officers who was assigned at Fort Loudon when it was massacred, and I believe was killed there, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Any more questions? That's interesting, Nelson. I hope you and others can tune in on our other programs, because these kinds of side stories are very interesting to bring into the discussion.
May I have a question more of the township system? When was the township system developed and when did it terminate?
I believe 1730 is when it was brought into line. It operated, I think, until the early 1770s, when they redefined the 96th district and other political divisions at that time. Is that your understanding, Andy?
I understand the beginning was 1730. I'm not sure about when you would say the end would be, because by then, I think it started off as 10 planned townships, and I think 9 of them, I'm not sure if all 10 got established, but then 9 of them got established, I think, is what I'm remembering. But, you know, and then of course, it ends up with the question of, is Charleston, you know, as we get towards the revolution, people are not happy with, like, not having powers in their own areas to be able to conduct legal business or whatever. So that we end up with that regulators and the moderators, all that stuff.
Yeah, I think closer to the revolution, they were realizing that they needed to have more representation in the backcountry, and they were starting to redefine districts formally then. Is that a question? Okay.
I would like to ask James a question, if he's there. James, I was just wondering where things are now with, like, digs and things, as far as, you know, archaeology in the area. But there's your study, the fort, is what I guess.
I'm sorry, Andy, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so it's right now, what are the plans, kind of archaeology, more archaeology to be conducted on the fort? Is another field season going on, or how's that going to work, you know?
Well, I'm unaware of any active projects in the park, and I'm reluctant to take any field work on until I've got this earlier field work published and kind of fully fleshed out. But there is potential for, and when I say potential, I mean for the types of resources that are out there. There's a wealth of potential out there for doing additional projects.
Crap, where did my coupon go now?
We may be pursuing some grant monies to do that. That's certainly something I'm going to be recommending that the city do. Any more questions? Guys, I think we can wrap it up. Again, thanks for your attending. We'll see you next on Thursday for the discussion of trees and forests in the Congaree Basin. And on the 19th, the discussion of, or the virtual tour of the Battle of Fort Congaree. And that will be given by our volunteer guides. Thanks very much for your attendance. It was great seeing everyone, and thank you. Have a good week and a good weekend.
Thank you for hosting everything, John.
Okay, thank you guys. Sorry for the glitches, but we're learning as we go, and I think most of the material got across. So I'm glad about that.
Thanks for speaking up, Andy. That helped a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Great job.
Yep.
Thank you, John. Y'all take care. Till
too.
next time. Bye-bye.